I've always thought of my life with Sarah as a steady river, calm on the surface, predictable in its flow. 8 years of marriage had smoothed out the rough edges of our early days, or so I believed. We lived in a quiet corner of Maple Street, a two-story house with ivy climbing the brick and a porch swing Sarah insisted we install. I'd come home from my IT consulting gigs, shoulders aching from hours hunched over code, and she'd greet me with that radiant smile, her auburn hair catching the last of the daylight. To the neighbors, we were the golden couple. Barbecues in the backyard, her laughter mingling with the sizzle of burgers, my quiet nods as I manned the grill. But lately, something felt off, like a shadow moving just beyond my sight. I'd been pulling late nights at the office, chasing deadlines for a client who couldn't decide what he wanted. Sarah never complained, at least not outright. She'd fill her days with yoga classes, her lithe frame bending into poses I could never dream of mimicking. And she'd come home glowing, her energy a stark contrast to my exhaustion. I'd catch her sometimes, staring out the kitchen window, her fingers tracing the rim of a wine glass, lost in thoughts she wouldn't share. "Just tired," she'd say when I asked, her voice soft but distant. I didn't push, maybe I should have. That night, I was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when the message popped up. It was from my father, Richard, a man I hadn't spoken to in years. We'd parted ways after a fallout over money and pride, his arrogance clashing with my stubbornness. The text was simple. "Tell Sarah the wine was exquisite." I stared at it, the words sinking into me like cold water. Richard didn't know Sarah, not really. He'd met her once, at our wedding, where he'd spent most of the night flirting with the bartender and ignoring me. Why was he messaging about her now? I glanced at Sarah, curled up in the armchair with a book, her legs tucked beneath her. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Did you talk to my dad recently?" She didn't look up, just turned a page. "No, why?" Her voice was too smooth, too quick. I held up the phone. "He says the wine was exquisite." "What's that about?" She shrugged, her eyes still on the book. "No idea. Maybe he's drunk again." I let it go, but the unease settled in my chest like a stone. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake it. Richard's wealth had always given him a sense of entitlement, a way of bending people to his will. He lived an hour away in a sprawling estate, surrounded by luxury I'd rejected when I chose a simpler life. Sarah had never shown interest in him, or so I thought. But now, every glance she gave her phone, every time she stepped out to run errands, felt like a thread unraveling. I started paying attention. Her yoga classes seemed longer, her excuses vaguer. One afternoon, I found a receipt in her purse. $1.80 for a bottle of Pinot Noir from a shop we never visited. We weren't wine people. I held it up when she got home, my voice tight. "What's this?" She barely flinched. "A gift for a client," she said, brushing past me to the kitchen. I wanted to believe her, but the river of our life was starting to churn. I've never been the jealous type, or at least I didn't think I was. Sarah's charm had always drawn people in, her laughter a magnet at parties, her quick wit smoothing over my quieter nature. I liked that about her, how she filled the spaces I left empty. But now, those spaces felt like chasms, and I couldn't stop wondering who was stepping into them. Richard's text gnawed at me, a splinter I couldn't pull out. I tried to focus on work, burying myself in server diagnostics and client calls, but my mind kept drifting back to that receipt, to Sarah's nonchalance, to the way she'd started locking her phone when she never used to. I decided to dig a little. It wasn't snooping. Not really, I told myself, just piecing things together. I logged into our shared bank account one night while she was out, meeting a friend. The transactions were a blur of groceries and gas. But then I saw it. A charge for $200 at a boutique hotel an hour away, dated 2 weeks ago. My stomach twisted. I'd been on a work trip that weekend, troubleshooting a network crash in Cleveland. Sarah had said she'd spent it with her sister, binge-watching old movies. I called her sister, Kate, the next morning, keeping it light. "Hey, how'd you like that movie night with Sarah a couple weeks back?" Kate laughed. "Movie night? I haven't seen her in months, Mark. She's been too busy bending herself into knots at that studio." The line went quiet, and I hung up, my pulse thudding in my ears. When Sarah got home that evening, I didn't confront her. Not yet. I watched her instead, noting the way she hummed as she chopped vegetables, the faint scent of lavender clinging to her hair. She seemed lighter, unburdened, and it infuriated me. "Good day?" I asked, leaning against the counter. She nodded, flashing that smile. "Yeah, taught a private session. Clients making progress." I nodded back, swallowing the questions burning my throat. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay beside her, listening to her steady breathing, wondering how she could rest so easily while I drowned in doubt. The next clue came by accident. I was fixing her laptop, some glitch with her yoga schedule app, and a notification pinged from her email. "Richard. Looking forward to Thursday." My hands froze. Thursday was tomorrow, and I had a late meeting scheduled. I clicked the email, my heart pounding. It was short. Same place, 7 p.m. wear the black dress. No context, no explanation. I stared at the screen, the words blurring. Richard. My father. The man who'd once told me I'd never amount to anything. Now planning a rendezvous with my wife. I closed the laptop, my mind racing. I could have confronted her then, demanded answers, but something colder took root. A need to know how deep this went, how far she'd fallen. I started tracking her. Felt wrong, but I couldn't stop. The next evening, I canceled my meeting, parked 2 streets over, and waited. At 6:45, she slipped out, wearing that black dress. Sleeveless, elegant, one I'd bought her for our anniversary. She drove off and I followed, keeping my distance. The road stretched toward Richard's estate, the lights of his gated property flickering in the dusk. She pulled in, and I watched from across the street as he greeted her at the door, his hand lingering on her back. My chest ached, a hollow pain I couldn't name. They disappeared inside, and I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, the river of our life now a raging flood tearing everything apart. I don't know how long I sat in that car, staring at Richard's mansion. The windows glowed yellow, mocking me with their warmth while I shivered in the dark. My wife, my Sarah, was in there with him, the man who'd spent my childhood belittling me, flaunting his wealth like a weapon. I wanted to storm in, kick down the door, drag her out by the arm, but my body wouldn't move. It wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation, a twisted knot of shame and rage tying me to that seat. I drove home eventually, the silence in the car louder than any scream. She didn't come back until 2 a.m. I heard the garage door hum, her footsteps padding up the stairs. I pretended to sleep as she slid into bed, the faint scent of his cologne, sandalwood and arrogance, clinging to her. Morning came, and she acted like nothing had changed, kissing my cheek before heading to her studio. I nodded through breakfast, my coffee growing cold, my mind already plotting. I needed proof, something undeniable, before I could face her or him. I called in sick and drove to Richard's place. He was out, probably golfing or schmoozing some investor, his housekeeper bustling around inside. I knew the security code, hadn't changed since I was a kid sneaking in to raid his liquor cabinet. Slipping into his study, I rifled through drawers, my hands trembling. Then I found it, a locked box under his desk. The key was taped to the underside, sloppy, for a man so meticulous. Inside were photos. Sarah, laughing in his lap, her arms around his neck, taken in that hotel room I'd seen on the bank statement. There were letters too, her handwriting, gushing about his generosity, his confidence. My knees buckled, but I kept going, snapping pictures with my phone, each click fueling the fire in my gut. Back home, I hid the evidence in my office, locked in a drawer she never touched. Sarah came home that night, all smiles, asking about my day. I played along, my voice steady, my eyes avoiding hers. "Quiet," I said. "Fixed some bugs." She nodded, oblivious, and I watched her move through our house like a stranger wearing my wife's skin. That's when the revenge took shape. Not a rash outburst, but something slow, deliberate, a dismantling of everything she valued. I started small. I canceled her yoga studio's lease quietly, through a shell company I set up with my IT skills. She'd find out in a week when the landlord called. I hacked her phone next, subtle tweaks to her calendar, rerouting her client emails to a dummy account. She'd think it was a glitch, blame the app, while her business crumbled. Richard was trickier. He had resources, layers of protection, but I knew his weaknesses. His vanity, his need to control. I'd hit him where it hurt most, but I needed time to plan. That night, lying beside her, I felt the shift. The river was gone, replaced by a dark, endless sea. She'd chosen him, his money, his power over me, and I'd make her regret it. Not with shouting or fists, but with precision, stripping away her world until she had nothing left to cling to. And Richard? He'd watch it all collapse, helpless, his empire tarnished by the son he'd dismissed. I closed my eyes, the first spark of satisfaction warming the cold hollow inside me. This was just the beginning. The days blurred into a haze of quiet fury after I found those photos. Sarah moved through our house like nothing was wrong, her laughter echoing off the walls, her touch brushing my arm as if it still meant something. I played my part, smiling, nodding, asking about her day, while inside, I was a coiled spring, waiting to snap. The evidence sat locked in my drawer, a silent witness to her deceit, and every glance at it sharpened my resolve. She'd chosen Richard, my own father, over me, and I'd make sure they both paid a price they couldn't imagine. I started with her yoga studio. It was her pride, her sanctuary, built from years of sweat and charm. I'd always admired how she'd turned a side gig into a thriving business, but now it was a liability I could exploit. Using a VPN and a burner email, I posed as an investor, contacting her landlord with an offer he couldn't refuse, double the rent for a 5-year lease, cash up front, if he evicted her by month's end. I wired the funds from a hidden account I'd set up years ago, a rainy day stash Sarah didn't know about. The landlord bit, and I got the confirmation 2 days later. Notice served. She'd find out soon, and I'd be there to watch the first crack form. When the call came, I was in the kitchen, sipping coffee, pretending to scroll through work emails. Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter, and she answered, her voice bright at first. "Hey Tom, what's up?" Then silence, her face paling as the landlord explained. "What do you mean, evicted? I've paid every month. There must be a mistake." I kept my eyes on my screen, my pulse steady, as her tone climbed. She hung up, slamming the phone down, and turned to me, eyes wide. "The studio's gone. Some investor swooped in and Tom's kicking me out. I don't understand. How does this happen?" I looked up, feigning concern. "That's awful, babe. Can you fight it?" She shook her head, pacing, her hands tugging at her hair. "I don't know. I need to call my lawyer." I nodded, sipping my coffee, savoring the bitter taste of her distress. That night, she barely slept, muttering about leases and savings while I lay still, mapping my next move. Richard was the bigger target, but I needed leverage, something to twist the knife deeper. I remembered his obsession with control, how he'd flaunted his wealth to keep people in line. His estate ran on a private server, a digital fortress for his finances and secrets. I'd worked on it as a teenager, back when he thought I'd inherit his empire. The old access codes were long gone, but I knew his habits, arrogant enough to reuse passwords, lazy enough not to update them. I spent hours in my office, probing his network with tools I'd honed over years of IT work. By dawn, I was staring at a goldmine of data, bank accounts, investments, emails. And there, buried in a folder labeled personal, were more photos of Sarah, timestamps matching her errands. The betrayal stung anew, but it fueled me. I didn't just want to hurt her. I wanted to dismantle the life she'd built on lies and drag Richard down with her. I copied everything, backing it up on an encrypted drive, and started planning. She'd lose the studio first, then her clients, her reputation. Richard, I'd hit him where his pride lived, exposing him in ways he couldn't buy his way out of. As the sun rose, I leaned back in my chair, the weight of my anger settling into something colder, sharper. This was war, and I'd strike without mercy. Sarah unraveled over the next week, and I watched it unfold with a quiet satisfaction that surprised me. The studio was her anchor, and without it, she floundered. Phone calls to lawyers, frantic meetings with clients, all while I sat across the dinner table, offering hollow sympathy. "You'll figure it out," I'd say, passing her the salt, my voice calm as her world crumbled. She didn't suspect me, not yet. I'd covered my tracks too well, the investor's identity buried under layers of fake names and offshore accounts. But the strain showed, her eyes red from sleepless nights, her smile forced. She started leaning on Richard more, her errands growing longer, and I let her, knowing every step tied her tighter to the trap. I turned my focus to her clients next. Her yoga business thrived on loyalty, wealthy housewives and stressed executives who adored her energy. I'd built her website years ago, still had admin access she'd forgotten about. Logging in, I tweaked the scheduling system, cancellations sent to her regulars, bookings rerouted to a dummy site I'd mocked up. Within days, her inbox flooded with complaints. "Where were you?" I showed up, but the studio was locked. She'd scramble to explain, blaming tech glitches, while I nodded along, suggesting she hire someone to fix it. "Maybe take a break," I said one night, watching her stare at her laptop, defeated. "You're burning out," she snapped. "I can't afford to, Mark. This is everything." I shrugged, hiding the smirk tugging at my lips. Richard's server was my real playground. I spent nights digging through his files, piecing together his life. Offshore accounts, shady deals, a mistress in Miami he'd kept from Sarah. Then I found the jackpot. A thread of emails between him and my wife, stretching back months. "You make me feel alive," she'd written, her words a knife in my gut. His replies were smug, dripping with possession. "Leave him, darling. I'll take care of you." My hands shook as I read, but I didn't stop. I archived it all, every line a weapon I'd wield when the time was right. He thought he'd won her, that his money and charm had erased me. He'd learn soon enough. I planted the first seed against him that weekend. Sarah was out, another meeting, and I used his server access to tweak his financials. Small changes, subtle enough to miss at first, transferring a few thousand from his main account to a charity he'd never support, adjusting his stock portfolio to tank a minor investment. He'd notice eventually, but not before I'd escalated. I wanted him paranoid, questioning his empire, while Sarah leaned on him harder, her own life spiraling. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd run to him for comfort, and I'd make sure he couldn't provide it. When she came home that night, reeking of his cologne, I didn't flinch. She kissed my cheek, mumbling about a rough day, and I smiled, asking if she'd eaten. She nodded, distracted, and I let her retreat to the shower, the sound of water masking the hum of my printer downstairs. I'd pulled one of Richard's photos, Sarah in his arms, laughing, and left it on my desk, debating my next move. Confrontation was too easy, too quick. I wanted them to suffer, to feel the ground shift beneath them before they understood why. As I locked the office door, I caught my reflection in the window. Hollow eyes, a man I barely recognized. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was survival, a reclaiming of everything they'd taken. And I was only getting started. By the third week, Sarah was a ghost of herself, and I reveled in it. The studio was officially gone. Her last class canceled, the space already leased to a juice bar chain. Her clients drifted away, confused by the scheduling chaos, and her phone stopped buzzing with bookings. She'd sit at the kitchen table, head in her hands, muttering about starting over, while I brewed coffee and murmured platitudes. "You're strong, Sarah. You'll bounce back." She'd nod, but her eyes were dull, her spirit fraying. I'd stripped her of her foundation, and she didn't even know my hand was on the axe. Richard, meanwhile, was starting to feel the heat. My tweaks to his finances had escalated. $50,000 siphoned to a random account in Belize. His car payment missed, triggering a repossession notice. I'd hacked his phone too, sending cryptic texts to his business partners. "Need to talk. Urgent." He'd scramble to explain, his temper flaring. I could imagine him shouting into the void, his control slipping. Sarah mentioned it one night, her voice tight. Richard's been off lately. Says someone's messing with him. I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Weird. Maybe it's karma. She glared at me, but I just smiled, stirring my tea. I upped the ante with her next. Using her email, I sent a mass message to her remaining contacts. Friends, family, clients, confessing she was taking a break due to personal struggles. I worded it vaguely, letting their imaginations fill in the gaps. Her sister called within hours, voice sharp. Sarah, what's going on? You're worrying everyone. I listened from the hall as she stammered. I didn't send that. What's happening? The confusion in her tone was delicious. A taste of the chaos she'd sown in me. She'd built her life on connections, and I was severing them one by one. Then I found the recording. Buried in Richard's server was an audio file. Him and Sarah. Their voices low, intimate, laughing about me. Mark's so predictable, she'd said, her giggle cutting deeper than any blade. He'll never see it coming, Richard replied, smug as ever. I played it on loop, letting the rage soak into me, hardening my edges. They'd mocked me, turned me into a punchline. Now I'd rewrite the story. I leaked the first breadcrumb that night. Using a throwaway account, I posted a snippet of their emails. Anonymous, no names, to a local gossip forum Sarah's crowd frequented. Someone's cozying up to a rich older guy, I wrote, attaching a blurred photo from Richard's stash. It took hours to catch fire, but by morning, her phone lit up with texts. Friends asking, "Is this you?" She stormed downstairs, pale, shoving the screen in my face. Look at this. Someone's spreading lies. Mark, what do I do? I frowned, playing dumb. That's crazy. Any idea who'd do this? She shook her head, pacing, and I watched the panic take root. Richard called her minutes later. I heard his voice through the line, sharp and accusing. Did you leak this, Sarah? My name's on the line. She denied it, tears welling, and I slipped upstairs, locking myself in my office. The forum buzzed with speculation, fingers pointing at her, at him. I'd lit the match and their world was starting to smoke. But this was still foreplay. The real blow would come soon, a reckoning they'd never recover from. I leaned back, the recording looping in my headphones, their laughter now a promise I'd silence. Step by step, I'd bury them, and they'd never see me coming. The chaos I'd unleashed was a living thing now, curling through Sarah's life like smoke, choking her slowly. That gossip forum post had been a spark, and the whispers were spreading. Her friends pulling back, her reputation fraying at the edges. She'd spend hours on the phone, voice trembling, trying to convince people it was a misunderstanding, a cruel prank. I don't know who's doing this, she'd say, pacing the living room, her eyes darting to me as if I might have answers. I'd shrug, offering a quiet, people can be awful, while my fingers itched to check the burner phone hidden in my office, tracking the fallout I'd engineered. Richard was unraveling too, and I savored every sign of it. His business partners were spooked by those cryptic texts I'd sent. Meetings canceled, deals paused, and the financial hiccups I'd planted were blooming into real problems. I'd escalated the siphoning, draining $200,000 into a maze of untraceable accounts, and tweaked his credit score with forged defaults. His car was gone, towed away in broad daylight, and I'd heard from a mutual acquaintance that he'd raged about it at his country club, red-faced and wild-eyed. Sarah came home one night, shaken, muttering about how stressed he was. He thinks someone's targeting him, she said, pouring a glass of wine with unsteady hands. I nodded, hiding the thrill pulsing through me. Maybe he's made enemies, I offered, and she shot me a look, sharp, searching, but said nothing. I pushed harder. Using Richard's server, I found his calendar, dinners, golf outings, a trip to Miami to see that mistress he thought was a secret. I leaked more crumbs, a vague email about discretion to his lawyer, paired with another blurred photo of him and Sarah, this time on his estate's balcony. I posted it to a broader site, one his circle frequented, and watched the speculation explode. Old money guy and a younger woman, typical. One comment read. Know her husband, poor guy. Another added. Sarah's name stayed out of it for now, but the noose was tightening. She'd see the post soon, and Richard's paranoia would do the rest. At home, she was a wreck. The email I'd faked to her contacts had severed her last ties. Her sister stopped calling. Clients ghosted her. Even her yoga buddies faded away. She'd sit on the couch, staring at nothing, her once vibrant energy dulled to ash. I feel like I'm losing everything, she whispered one night, her head in her hands. I sat beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder, my voice soft. You've still got me. She nodded, leaning into me, and I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. Her touch, once a comfort, was a reminder of every lie she'd fed me, every moment she'd spent in his arms. I couldn't sleep that night, the weight of my plan pressing down. I slipped into my office, pulling up the recording again, her laughter, his smug voice, and let it fuel me. They'd mocked me, built something sordid on my trust, and I'd make them choke on it. I drafted the next move. An email from Richard's account to Sarah, cold and cutting. This is getting messy. We're done. I'd send it soon, let her feel the sting of rejection from the man she'd chosen over me. But that was just the prelude. The real strike was brewing, a blow to shatter them both. I leaned back, the screen's glow casting shadows on my face, and felt the river of my old life dry up completely. All that remained was the storm I'd summon next. Sarah broke the morning I sent that email. I timed it perfectly. She was in the kitchen, sipping tea when her phone chimed. I watched from the doorway as she opened it, her face crumpling like paper in a fist. No, she whispered, scrolling. Then louder. No, he can't mean this. She dialed him, her voice shaking as it went to voicemail. Richard, call me back. What's going on? We need to talk. She hung up, tears streaking her cheeks, and I stepped in, feigning concern. What's wrong? She shoved the phone at me, the screen showing his words. This is getting messy. We're done. Don't contact me. I frowned, handing it back. That's harsh. What happened between you two? She froze, eyes wide, then stammered. Nothing. Just friends. He's been helping me. I nodded, letting the lie hang between us, thick and heavy. She spent the day spiraling, calling him again, texting, pacing the house like a caged animal. I stayed out of her way, locked in my office, monitoring Richard's reaction. He'd seen the email. I'd bounced it through his server to look legit, and his replies to her calls were silence, probably assuming she'd leaked those posts in a tantrum. I'd planted doubt in both of them, a wedge driven deep. By evening, she was a mess, curled on the couch, wine glass trembling in her hand. He won't answer, she said, voice raw. I don't understand. I sat across from her, my tone gentle. Maybe he's not who you thought. She glared at me, but the fight was gone, her spirit buckling under the weight of abandonment. Richard's world was cracking too. I'd moved bigger pieces now. $500,000 shifted from his primary account to a charity he despised. A public donation in his name with a press release I'd faked. Local tycoon gives back. His phone blew up with calls. Reporters, partners, his lawyer. And I watched the chaos unfold through his hacked email. He fired off furious messages, denying it, but the damage was done. His reputation, his control were slipping, and I wasn't finished. I leaked more, full emails this time, naming Sarah, posted to a site his peers couldn't ignore. Richard and the Yoga Wife, the thread titled, with screenshots of her gushing about his generosity. The scandal hit like a wave, and I knew it'd reach her soon. It did that night. Her phone buzzed with a friend's text. Sarah, is this true? You and some rich guy. She scrolled, gasping, as the post spread. Her name, his, their affair laid bare. She turned to me, pale, shaking. Mark, look at this. Someone's ruining me. I took the phone, scanning the screen with a grimace I'd practiced. This is bad. How'd they get this stuff? She shook her head, sobbing. I don't know. I didn't do anything wrong. The lie was so bold I almost laughed, but I held it in, resting a hand on her back. "We'll figure it out," I said, my voice a mask over the glee bubbling inside. I left her there, retreating to my office to plan the final act. Richard's empire was teetering. Partners pulling out, his mistress dumping him via text I'd intercepted, and Sarah was a pariah, her life in ashes. But it wasn't enough. I wanted them to face each other, to see the wreckage I'd made of their betrayal. I drafted one last email, from her to him. "Meet me tomorrow, 7 p.m., your place. We end this together." I'd send it from both their accounts, a collision course they couldn't avoid. As I saved it, I caught my reflection in the monitor. Eyes cold, jaw set. I didn't recognize myself anymore. But I didn't care. They'd forged this monster, and I'd bury them with it. The next day crawled by, every tick of the clock a drumbeat to the showdown I'd orchestrated. Sarah barely spoke, her eyes swollen from crying. Her phone silent now that her world had turned on her. She didn't suspect me. Not yet. But I caught her glancing my way, searching for something I wouldn't give. I kept busy, tinkering with a client's server remotely, my alibi if she ever questioned where my mind was. At 6 p.m., she grabbed her keys, mumbling about needing air. I didn't stop her. I knew where she was going. The email had landed in both their inboxes hours ago, and Richard, cornered by his own mess, wouldn't resist the bait. I followed at a distance, the familiar road to his estate winding through dusk. She pulled into his drive, and I parked across the street, hidden by trees, my phone recording through the windshield. Richard opened the door, his face a storm of anger and fatigue, and she stormed in, her voice carrying sharp, desperate. "You can't just cut me off like this." He snapped back. "You've ruined me. Those leaks, this scandal. It's all you." She recoiled, shouting, "I didn't leak anything. You think I'd do this to myself?" Their words overlapped, a tangle of blame, and I watched, my pulse steady, as the trap snapped shut. I'd rigged his security cameras days ago, looping old footage to mask my earlier break-in. Now I patched into the live feed, capturing every second of their clash. She slapped him, a crack that echoed, and he grabbed her wrist, snarling, "You're nothing without me." She yanked free, tears streaming, and screamed, "I gave up everything for you." The admission hung there, raw and undeniable, and I zoomed in, the lens catching her crumpled face, his sneer. This was gold, proof of their betrayal, their collapse, all in high definition. They didn't notice the shift outside me, slipping closer, planting a USB drive in his mailbox. It held everything. The emails, the photos, the recording of their mockery, and now this footage. I'd send copies to his lawyer, his partners, her family. Anonymous, untraceable, a final blow to bury them. As I retreated to my car, their voices faded, the fight burning itself out. Sarah stumbled out 20 minutes later, mascara streaked, and drove off, her car swerving slightly. Richard stood in the doorway, staring after her, then slammed it shut. I waited, letting the night settle before heading home. She was there when I arrived, curled on the couch, staring at the wall. I sat beside her, silent, and she whispered, "It's over, Mark. Everything's gone." I nodded, resting a hand on her knee. "I know." She didn't catch the edge in my voice, the weight of my meaning. I'd won this round, her life in ruins, his teetering, but the endgame loomed. That USB would drop tomorrow, a public execution of their pride, and I'd be there, the quiet husband, picking up the pieces they'd never suspect I'd scattered. The storm was peaking, and I was its eye, calm and merciless. The morning after their showdown, I woke early, the house silent except for Sarah's shallow breathing from the couch. She'd fallen asleep there, wine glass tipped over on the rug, a stain spreading like blood. I stepped over it, heading to my office, the USB drive's contents burning a hole in my mind. I'd spent the night refining the delivery, anonymous emails queued up, each with a chunk of the evidence. The photos, the recording, the footage of their fight. Recipients included Richard's lawyer, his top investors, Sarah's sister, and a local journalist with a nose for scandal. I'd masked my tracks, VPNs, spoofed IPs, layers of encryption honed from years in IT. No one would trace it back to me. I hit send at 7 a.m., the soft click of my mouse, a gunshot in the quiet. Then I waited, brewing coffee, watching Sarah stir as the day crept in. Her phone buzzed first. Kate, her sister, voice shrill through the speaker. Sarah, what is this? Pictures of you and some old guy. Mark deserves to know. Sarah bolted upright, fumbling the phone, her voice cracking. It's not what it looks like. Someone's framing me. I leaned in the doorway, sipping my mug, my face a mask of confusion. What's going on? She stared at me, eyes wild, then thrust the phone away like it burned. Nothing, just lies. I'll fix it. But her hands shook, and I knew the dam was breaking. Richard's world imploded next. I'd cloned his email feed to my laptop, and the replies poured in. His lawyer demanding a meeting, investors pulling funds, the journalist asking for comment. Millionaire's affair rocks elite circle. Her draft headline read, attached to a screen cap of him and Sarah on his balcony. He fired off panicked messages, blaming Sarah, threatening lawsuits, but the tide was too strong. I pictured him in that gaudy study, pacing, his empire crumbling, and felt a flicker of something. Satisfaction, yes, but hollow too, like ash in my mouth. Sarah's unraveling was quieter, more personal. Kate showed up an hour later, banging on the door, her face a storm of betrayal. How could you do this to Mark? She shouted, shoving the printed emails in Sarah's face. I stepped in, playing the shocked husband. Kate, calm down. What's this about? She turned to me, eyes softening with pity. She's been with your dad, Mark. There's proof, pictures, everything. Sarah sobbed, denying it, but Kate tossed the papers and left, slamming the door. I picked one up, Sarah in Richard's lap, laughing, and looked at her, my voice low. Is this true? She crumpled, whispering. It's not what you think. I was lost, Mark, I swear. I nodded, letting her cling to me, her tears soaking my shirt, while inside, I tallied the next move. By noon, the story was everywhere. Online forums, local news, even a radio snippet I caught driving to clear my head. Sarah stayed home, curled up, phone off, while I mailed the USB to Richard's housekeeper with a note. For your boss. He'll want to see this. It'd reach him tonight, the final nail. I drove back, the weight of it settling in. Not just revenge, but annihilation. They'd mocked me, built their fling on my trust, and now they drown in the wreckage. I wasn't done, though. The public fall was sweet, but I wanted them to face me, to see the architect of their ruin. That night, I planned the endgame. The river of my old life, a distant memory, replaced by this dark, unrelenting tide. Sarah barely moved the next day, a shadow in our house, her eyes vacant as the scandal swallowed her. The phone stayed silent, friends gone, family turned away, her world reduced to whispers and shame. I watched her from the kitchen, flipping through a newspaper that screamed, Tycoon's Secret Romance in bold print, her blurred face beside Richard's. She didn't notice, didn't ask why I wasn't raging or packing my bags. I'd mastered the mask. Quiet concern, a husband blindsided but holding it together. You okay? I'd murmur, and she'd nod, mechanical, lost in her own collapse. Richard's fate was louder. The USB hit his desk that morning. I tracked the delivery, and his email erupted with fury. Who sent this? I'll bury them. He wrote to his lawyer, attaching the fight footage. Too late. The press had it all, and his partners were bailing. His mistress publicly dumping him on social media with a scathing post. Dodged a bullet with this creep. I'd leaked her number from his server, nudging her to the edge, and she jumped. His stock plummeted, his name a punchline, and I pictured him alone in that mansion, raging at ghosts. Good. Let him stew. I called him that afternoon, my voice steady, the first direct strike. Dad, I said when he picked up, his breathing heavy on the line. Mark, what do you want? He snapped, suspicion thick. I know about you and Sarah, I said, pausing as he sputtered. Don't play dumb, it's over. Everyone knows. He cursed, blaming her, but I cut him off. Meet me tomorrow, 8 p.m., your place. We settle this. He hesitated, then growled, fine, and hung up. I smiled, the hook set. Sarah was next. That evening, I sat her down, the photos from Richard's box spread on the table. Her in his lap, his hand on her thigh. She gasped, hands flying to her mouth. Where'd you get these? I leaned back, eyes cold. Does it matter? You lied, Sarah. For months. She cried, reaching for me, but I pulled away. I was weak, Mark. He offered me something you couldn't. Her words were a slap, and I let them hang, fueling me. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., we go to his place. You face him with me. She nodded, broken, and I walked away, locking myself in my office. They'd see each other, raw and ruined, and I'd wield the final blow. I spent the night prepping. Every file, every recording, backed up and ready. I'd bring a projector, turn his study into a theater of their shame. The press would get a tip after, an anonymous source with the full story. But first, I'd watch them squirm. Sarah thought I wanted closure. Richard thought I'd grovel or threaten. Neither knew I'd already won, that this was just the curtain call. As I packed the gear, I caught my reflection. Gaunt, steely, a man forged in their betrayal. I didn't feel triumph, not yet, just a cold, relentless drive to finish it. The drive to Richard's estate was silent. Sarah beside me, her hands twisting in her lap. She'd barely spoken all day, her face pale, eyes red, the weight of her choices crushing her. I kept mine on the road, the projector and laptop in the back seat, my plan a coiled snake ready to strike. She glanced at me once, whispering, "What are we doing, Mark?" I didn't look at her. "Ending it," I said, and she shrank back, sensing something she couldn't name. The sky was dark, clouds heavy, a fitting shroud for what was coming. We pulled into his drive at 8 sharp, his mansion looming, lights dimmer than usual, power half-cut, thanks to a utility glitch I'd triggered via his hacked account. He opened the door, disheveled, tie loose, his face a mix of rage and exhaustion. "You?" he spat at me, then glared at Sarah. "And you? Thought you'd drag me down further?" She flinched, but I stepped between them, voice calm. "Inside. Now." He smirked, thinking he still held power, and led us to his study, the room where I'd found their secrets. I set up fast. Projector on his desk, laptop linked, the screen glowing against the wall. They watched, uneasy, as I plugged in the USB. "Sit," I said, and they did. Sarah on a chair, Richard on his leather sofa, his arms crossed. "What's this nonsense?" he growled, but I ignored him, hitting play. The recording started, her giggle, his smug voice. "Mark's so predictable." Sarah gasped, hands to her face. Richard's jaw tightened. Then the photos flashed, her in his lap, his estate, the hotel room. Followed by the fight footage, her slap, his sneer. "You're nothing without me." His voice boomed, and she sobbed. "I gave up everything." They turned on each other instantly. "You recorded us?" Sarah shrieked at him. "You leaked it, you witch!" he roared back. I stood silent, letting them claw, then spoke, low and sharp. "No, I did." They froze, staring at me. Sarah's eyes wide, Richard's narrowing. "Every leak, every loss. You did this to yourselves, and I made sure the world saw." I pulled up his bank records next. Millions drained, deals dead. Then her email, the fake confession that torched her life. "You built this on my back," I said, voice steel. "Now it's gone." Sarah collapsed, wailing, "Mark, please, I'm sorry." Richard lunged, fists clenched, but I sidestepped, calm. "Touch me, and the press gets this live." He stopped, breathing hard, defeated. I packed the gear, leaving the USB on the desk. "It's over. You're nothing now, both of you." I walked out, Sarah's cries echoing, Richard's curses fading. The tip went to the journalist as I drove home. Full story. Full proof. By morning, they'd be headlines, their lives ash. I felt no joy, just a cold, empty quiet. The storm was done, and I was all that remained. The morning after the showdown, I woke to a world reshaped by my hands. The house was silent. Sarah hadn't come home, likely still at Richard's or hiding somewhere, licking her wounds. I didn't care. My phone buzzed with alerts. Millionaires fall. Affair and fraud exposed. The headline blared, the journalist wasting no time. Her article laid it all out. Richard's financial ruin, the leaked emails, the photos, even snippets of that fight footage I'd fed her. Sarah's name was there too, the yoga instructor caught in the web. Her life a footnote to his collapse. I scrolled through it, sipping coffee, the taste bitter but fitting. The storm I'd unleashed had leveled them, and I stood alone in its wake. I drove to the office, needing routine to anchor me. Colleagues whispered as I passed. Word had spread. My poor husband, role cemented by the public narrative. Tough break, Mark, one said, clapping my shoulder. I nodded, playing the part, while inside, I tallied the wreckage. Richard's empire was dust. Partners gone, assets frozen by lawsuits, his mansion up for sale to cover debts I'd inflated. Sarah's studio was a memory, her social circle a graveyard of burned bridges. I'd stripped them bare, and the world applauded me as the victim, oblivious to my strings. She called at noon, her voice a rasp. Mark, where are you? We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I'm at work. What's left to say? She sobbed, broken. I'm sorry, I was stupid, lost. I'll do anything to fix this. I let the silence stretch, her pleas a faint echo of the woman I'd loved. You chose him, I said finally, cold. Live with it. I hung up, blocking her number, the last tie severed. She'd crawl back eventually, but I'd be gone. Physically, emotionally, a ghost to her ruin. Richard's move came later, a lawyer's letter, threatening to sue for defamation, claiming I'd doctored the evidence. I laughed, forwarding it to my own attorney with the originals. Untouched, time-stamped, irrefutable. Let him try, I told her over the phone. He's got nothing left. She agreed, promising to bury him if he pushed. He wouldn't, his pride was shattered, his resources drained. I checkmated him, and he knew it. By evening, the radio buzzed with updates. Disgraced tycoon retreats from public eye. Good riddance. I went home. The house too big now, its echoes mocking me. I packed a bag, clothes, laptop, the essentials, and listed it with a realtor. I didn't need Maple Street anymore. Its memories tainted. The revenge was done, but the hollow ache lingered, a scar I'd carry. I'd won, yet lost everything that once mattered. As I locked the door, I glanced at the porch swing, Sarah's dream, and felt nothing. The river was dry, the storm spent. I drove off, the horizon open, my next move unwritten. Weeks passed, the dust settling into a new normal. I'd rented a small apartment downtown, a sterile box with no past, just walls and quiet. Work kept me busy, clients piling up, my reputation as the steady guy, intact despite the headlines fading. People stopped asking about Sarah, about Richard, their pity replaced by awkward silences. I liked it that way, alone, free, the architect of my solitude. But the echoes of their fall still reached me, faint ripples in the wreckage I'd left. Sarah surfaced first. Kate called, voice tight, saying she'd moved into a cheap rental an hour away, waitressing to scrape by. She's a mess, Mark. Asks about you, cries all the time. I shrugged, unseen through the phone. She made her bed. Kate sighed, agreeing, and hung up. I pictured Sarah, her glow gone, hands cracked from dishwater, serving strangers who whispered her name. Her sister sent a photo later. Sarah, thin, eyes sunken, staring at a plate of fries. I deleted it, but the image stuck, a bitter taste of victory laced with something I couldn't name. Richard's end was uglier. The mansion sold at auction, pennies on the dollar, his belongings scattered, furniture, art, that leather sofa where he'd posed with her. A tabloid ran a shot of him leaving, gray and hunched, climbing into a beat-up sedan. His lawyer dropped the suit. His accounts seized by creditors I'd tipped off with forged debts. Word was he'd holed up in a condo somewhere, drinking himself numb, his mistress long gone. His name a curse in the circles he'd ruled. I'd broken him, stripped his throne, and left him a king of nothing. I saw Sarah once, by chance, at a gas station weeks later. She didn't see me. I was in my car, filling up, when she shuffled out, hair lank, carrying a bag of chips. She looked small, fragile, a stranger wearing my wife's face. Our eyes met for a second, hers widening, but I turned away, starting the engine. She didn't follow, didn't call out, just stood there as I pulled off. I didn't feel triumph, just a cold confirmation. She was gone, a casualty of her own choices, my hand the blade. The nights grew longer, my apartment a cave of silence. I'd sit with a beer, replaying it all, the texts, the photos, the moment I turned their mockery into ruin. It wasn't joy I felt, but power, a dark thread stitching me together. They'd underestimated me, and I'd buried them for it. Yet the hollow stayed, a shadow I couldn't shake. I dismantled their lives, but mine was rubble too. Just quieter, cleaner. I didn't regret it, though. This was justice, my way, and I'd sleep with that. Months later, I stood at a crossroads. Literally, a highway stretching north. My car packed with what little I'd kept. The apartment lease was up, the house sold, the money banked in an account Sarah couldn't touch. I'd quit my job, freelancing now, untethered from the life I'd known. The scandal had faded. Richard a footnote, Sarah a ghost. And I was ready to vanish too. No one needed Mark from Maple Street anymore, least of all me. I'd rebuilt myself in the fire of their betrayal, and this was my reset. I heard about Sarah one last time, through a client who'd known her. She'd moved again, farther off, teaching yoga in a community center for pennies. Her name's still a whisper of shame. She talks about you sometimes, he said, casual. Says she messed up the best thing she had. I nodded, filing it away, unbothered. She'd live with that regret. A life sentence I'd handed down without lifting a finger. Richard was worse. Spotted at a dive bar, bloated, ranting about conspiracies, his fortune a memory. They'd fallen, and I'd walked away, the victor in a game they'd never understood. Driving north, the road unfurled, trees flanking the asphalt, the sky wide and gray. I didn't know where I'd land. Somewhere quiet, maybe a cabin, a place to breathe. The hollow lingered, but it was mine now, a companion I'd earned. I'd loved her once, trusted him in some warped way, and they'd twisted that into something ugly. I turned it back, made it a weapon, and won. The cost was high. My heart, my home, but I'd paid it willingly. I stopped at a diner that night, the neon sign buzzing, and sat with a coffee, watching the world move on. A couple laughed at the counter, easy and light, and I felt a pang. Not envy, but memory. That was gone for me, burned away in the storm I'd summoned. I didn't mind. I'd forged something new, cold, yes, but strong. A man who'd faced betrayal and crushed it. The waitress smiled, refilling my cup, and I nodded back, the first spark of peace settling in. The river was dead, the storm passed. This was my dawn, and I'd face it alone, unbroken.